The morning of January 12, 1945, was clear over the railhead town of Lido, in the northeastern corner of India. The sun had not yet reached full height when the military police stopped traffic along the main road, and a column of vehicles, 113 of them jeeps and deuce-and-a-half cargo trucks and Signal Corps motorcycles, lined up along the muddy verge like an olive drab ribbon stretching back into the jungle. A three-star jeep sat at the head of the column. Behind its windshield, in the front passenger seat, rode a broad-shouldered colonel who had been promoted to brigadier general just 11 months before. His name was Louis A. Pick, and he had been sent to this forgotten corner of the war because the man before him had failed to move fast enough. Pick was 53 years old, a civil engineer from Virginia who had survived the catastrophic Mississippi flood of 1927 and spent the years between the wars calculating how much Earth machine could move in a day. He was not a man who used the word impossible. He was not a man who accepted the judgment of people who had never stood in the rain with a surveying rod in their hands. Now, he was sitting at mile marker 0, the most controversial road in the entire Allied war effort. Behind him stretched 472 miles of roadway that his men had cut, blasted, bridged, and graded to the most hostile terrain on the surface of the earth. Mountains that rose to 9,000 feet, passes so steep that a laden truck could not negotiate them in a forward gear, valleys that received 140 inches of rain in 5 months, rivers wide enough to swallow a bridge overnight. Ahead of him, another 600 miles of existing road connected to Kunming, in China's Yunnan province, where nationalist Chinese armies were waiting for supplies that only this road could deliver at volume, in the quantities that could rearm 30 infantry divisions and alter the balance of the entire Pacific War. But before that convoy moved a single yard, Pick already knew what history would say about what he had built. Churchill had called it an immense, laborious task, unlikely to be finished before the need for it had passed. The generals in Washington had spent 2 years debating whether it was worth the cost in men, machines, and material. The strategic planners on both sides of the Atlantic had argued that the tonnage flown over the Himalayan air route, the famous and terrible hump, would always exceed what any road through that terrain could carry. Even General Joseph Stilwell, the American commander whose strategic vision had conceived the road and who had fought every battle that made it possible, had been recalled from command 3 months earlier, dismissed before his project was finished, a casualty of politics as much as war. Pick knew all of this. He had heard every objection, read every memorandum, absorbed every calculation from the skeptics who sat in comfortable offices in Delhi and London and Washington, and explained, with great patience, why the road he was building could not be built. He gave the order to move out. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what Pick was doing on that January morning and why it mattered in ways the skeptics had fundamentally failed to understand, you have to go back to the spring of 1942, when a series of catastrophic events closed the only land door between the Western Allies and the government of nationalist China, and left 400 million people on the far side of a wall of mountains with no way in and no way out. The Burma Road had been one of the engineering wonders of Asia. The Chinese had built it themselves in 1937 and 1938, using hand labor, no bulldozers, no power shovels, nothing but picks, baskets, and the organized effort of 200,000 conscripted workers to push a graded gravel bridge road 717 miles across the grain of the lower Himalayas, from the railhead at Lashio in northern Burma to the city of Kunming in China's Yunnan province. It crossed gorges carved by the Mekong and Salween rivers. It switchbacked up gradients that defied easy description. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary act of national will. By 1940, the road was carrying roughly 10,000 tons of supplies a month into China. Gasoline, ammunition, artillery shells, spare parts, medicine, radio equipment. The material sinew a nation that had been at war with Japan since 1937 and needed everything. The Burma Road was, in a very literal sense, the lifeline of China's resistance. In April of 1942, the Japanese army overran Burma in a campaign that destroyed 3 Chinese divisions and drove the British forces under General Harold Alexander back across the Indian border in a retreat that barely avoided becoming a massacre. On the 29th of April, Japanese troops entered Lashio. The railhead was gone. The Burma Road was cut at its source. and China, which had been holding the Western anchor of Allied strategy in the Pacific for 5 years, was suddenly cut off from every supply route by both land and sea. The only thing that stood between complete Chinese strategic isolation and the collapse of Chiang Kai-shek's government was an air corridor, a route from airfields in northeastern India across the eastern Himalayan ridges and into Yunnan. The pilots who flew it called it the hump. The men who went down in the mountains called it the aluminum trail. The ridgelines along the route were so thick with wreckage from crashed transport aircraft that the name was, in a grim and literal way, accurate. Flying the hump was one of the most dangerous assignments in the American Air Forces. The C-47 Dakota, the workhorse of Allied airlift operations, was not designed for the altitudes or the weather conditions it encountered over those mountains. The Himalayas generated their own weather, violent updrafts and downdrafts that could flip a loaded transport aircraft in seconds, ice that accumulated on wings faster than de-icers could shed it, turbulence so savage that cargo broke free of its lashings and tore through the fuselage. In the early months of the airlift, the loss rate per flying hour was among the highest of any air operation in the entire war. And even setting aside the losses, the arithmetic was punishing. AC-47 carrying 3 tons of cargo burned enough fuel on a round trip that the net delivery to China worked out to something far less than its stated capacity. In the early months of 1943, the entire hump operation was delivering fewer than 3,000 tons of supplies per month to China. China's military was consuming that, and more, just to sustain its existing position. There was nothing left for expansion, nothing for the rearming of divisions, nothing for the kind of offensive that could pull Japanese pressure away from the Pacific Islands where American forces were fighting and dying. The strategic situation was not merely difficult. It was approaching a kind of slow-motion catastrophe. Without adequate supply, Chiang Kai-shek's government was losing the organizational capacity to resist further Japanese pressure. Without Chinese resistance tying down the Japanese army in mainland Asia, Japan could redeploy significant ground forces to the Pacific Islands. Without those supplies, the war in the Pacific would cost more lives, take more time, and demand more of everything the United States was already straining to produce. Someone had to solve the problem of supply. And the only real solution, the only solution that could deliver the tonnage that China actually needed, was a road. General Joseph Warren Stilwell had been thinking about this problem since before the fall of Burma. Stilwell was a complicated man, one of the most fluent Chinese speakers in the American Army, a soldier who had spent years as a military attaché in China before the war and understood the country with a depth that almost none of his contemporaries could match. He was also blunt to the point of insubordination, held virtually everyone he worked with in varying degrees of contempt, and had a talent for making enemies among people whose cooperation he desperately needed. His troops called him Vinegar Joe. The Chinese call him a man who shared hardship with common soldiers, which in their context was high praise. His superiors in Washington called him a problem. But on the question of supply, Stilwell was clear-eyed and correct in a way that the more comfortable strategists were not. You could not sustain a major Allied war effort in China by air alone. The physics of it were against you. The weather was against you. The capacity of the aircraft available was against you. What you needed was a road, and the only place a road could be built was from Lido in the state of Assam in northeastern India, across the Pakai mountain range, down into the Yukon Valley of northern Burma, and eventually to the junction at Monyu, where it would connect with the surviving western section of the old Burma Road. The distance from Lido to the junction was 465 miles. Every mile of it would have to be built from scratch, through unsurveyed territory, across major rivers, over mountain passes, through jungle so dense that the first task in any given stretch was to find out what was there before you could decide what to do about it. When Stilwell presented this plan to his British counterparts in the fall of 1942, the response was polite, respectful, and deeply skeptical. The British had surveyed portions of this terrain in the previous century, when their railway engineers were looking for a route from Assam into Burma. Those engineers had concluded that a road was theoretically feasible for the Pakai Range by way of the Pangsau Pass. But they had also concluded that the effort would be extraordinary and that the maintenance challenges would be severe. The monsoon season, which arrived reliably each May and lasted through October, deposited more rain on this particular piece of the world than almost anywhere else on Earth. 140 inches a year, much of it falling in violent, concentrated bursts that turned every stream into a torrent, every slope into a mudslide, every road surface into a brown river of saturated gravel. Winston Churchill, who had a gift for the memorable phrase, even when the memorable phrase was wrong, summarized the British position with characteristic economy. He called the Lido Road project, in a written assessment circulated among Allied planners, an immense, laborious task, unlikely to be finished until the need for it has passed. In Churchill's view, and in the view of most British strategic planners, the resources required to build a road will be better spent on naval operations in the Indian Ocean or on the campaign in Europe. The road was a distraction from more important priorities. It was a monument to American stubbornness in the face of strategic reality. Someone had to solve the problem of supply. And the only solution that could deliver the tonnage that China actually needed, was a road. General Joseph Warren Stilwell had been thinking about this problem since before the fall of Burma. Stilwell was a complicated man, one of the most fluent Chinese speakers in the American Army, a soldier who had spent years as a military attaché in China before the war and understood the country with a depth that almost none of his contemporaries could match. He was also blunt to the point of insubordination, held virtually everyone he worked with in varying degrees of contempt, and had a talent for making enemies among people whose cooperation he desperately needed. His troops called him Vinegar Joe. The Chinese call him a man who shared hardship with common soldiers, which in their context was high praise. His superiors in Washington called him a problem. But on the question of supply, Stilwell was clear-eyed and correct in a way that the more comfortable strategists were not. You could not sustain a major Allied war effort in China by air alone. The physics of it were against you. The weather was against you. The capacity of the aircraft available was against you. What you needed was a road, and the only place a road could be built was from Lido in the state of Assam in northeastern India, across the Patkai mountain range, down into the Hukong Valley of northern Burma, and eventually to the junction at Monyu, where it would connect with the surviving western section of the old Burma Road. The distance from Lido to the junction was 465 miles. Every mile it would have to be built from scratch, through unsurveyed territory, across major rivers, over mountain passes, through jungle so dense that the first task in any given stretch was to find out what was there before you could decide what to do about it. When Stilwell presented this plan to his British counterparts in the fall of 1942, the response was polite, respectful, and deeply skeptical. The British had surveyed portions of this terrain in the previous century, when their railway engineers were looking for a route from Assam into Burma. Those engineers had concluded that a road was theoretically feasible through the Patkai Range by way of the Pongsao Pass. But they had also concluded that the effort would be extraordinary and that the maintenance challenges would be severe. The monsoon season, which arrived reliably each May and lasted through October, deposited more rain on this particular piece of the world than almost anywhere else on Earth. 140 inches a year, much of it falling in violent concentrated bursts that turned every stream into a torrent, every slope into a mudslide, every road surface into a brown river of saturated gravel. Winston Churchill, who had a gift for the memorable phrase, even when the memorable phrase was wrong, summarized the British position with characteristic economy. He called the Lido Road project, in a written assessment circulated among Allied planners, an immense, laborious task, unlikely to be finished until the need for it has passed. In Churchill's view, and in the view of most British strategic planners, the resources required to build a road will be better spent on naval operations in the Indian Ocean or on the campaign in Europe. The road was a distraction from more important priorities. It was a monument to American stubbornness in the face of strategic reality. Chennault was not wrong about the numbers. Exactly. He was right that the airlift would, in the end, deliver more total tonnage than the road. He was right that the projected capacity figures that Stilwell had cited, 65,000 tons per month, once the road was complete, were optimistic beyond any realistic assessment of what truck transport over a mountain road could achieve. He was right that the road, when it finally opened, would never reach those numbers. What Chennault and Churchill and the skeptics in Washington could not see, what only became clear in retrospect, was that the road was not just a pipe for tonnage. It was a moving front. As Pick's bulldozers pushed further into Burma, They were advancing through territory that Japanese forces had been defending at enormous cost in men and material. The supply of American and Chinese troops fighting that Japanese defense depended, in large part, on the road itself. Without the road, there was no supply line for Stilwell's offensive in northern Burma. Without Stilwell's offensive, the Japanese 18th Division retained control of the Yukon Valley and the Mogaung Valley and the approaches to Myitkyina. And without Myitkyina, without the airfields there, the hump air route remained long, high, dangerous, and constrained by the range of aircraft and the threat of Japanese interception. Every mile of road that Pick's men built was not just a mile of potential truck capacity. It was a mile of secured territory that shortened the air route, reduced the altitude at which transports had to fly, eliminated one more Japanese intercept opportunity, and increased the effective capacity of the airlift by a factor that no planning document had accounted for. The road and the air route were not alternatives to each other. They were interdependent systems, each making the other more effective. The planners who saw only the tonnage numbers had been asking the wrong question. None of this was fully understood in the fall of 1943, as Pick took command of a construction project that was behind schedule, undermanned, under-equipped by any reasonable standard, operating in terrain that had defeated every previous attempt to push a road through it, and sustained principally by the determination of the soldiers who were building it and the stubbornness of the general who had conceived it. What was understood was that somewhere on the far side of those mountains, the armies of China needed to be resupplied, and the only man who believed he could get a road to them was a Virginia engineer who had learned the limits of limits during the Great Flood of 1927, and who had come to Assam with the unshakable conviction that there was no engineering problem that sufficient will, sufficient machinery, and sufficient unwillingness to stop could not eventually solve. The monsoon returned in May of 1944 with a ferocity that anyone who had spent time in Assam would have expected. The Patkai Range receives more concentrated rainfall than almost any other mountain terrain on Earth. During the 5-month monsoon season, the rain did not so much fall as arrive, in curtains so dense that a man standing 10 feet away was invisible, in quantities that turned the road surface from gravel into brown slurry, within hours of the last maintenance truck passing over it. A soldier named Mose J. Davy, who worked on the Lido Road during the monsoon, described it in terms that stayed with him for the rest of his life. The road would wash out, he said, and they would have to go back and rebuild overnight. Not rebuild in the sense of patching. Rebuild in the sense of starting again from the muddy subgrade, laying gravel, compacting it, and having it ready for the next convoy by morning. This happened not once or twice, but repeatedly in the same sections through the entire 5 months of the wet season. The engineers were not building a road through the jungle. They were maintaining a moving argument with a landscape that was trying, with considerable geological assistance, to erase every trace of their work. The organizational challenge was immense. Pick had divided his workforce into sections, each responsible for a defined stretch of road and a defined schedule of maintenance operations. The engineering battalions rotated between construction work on new sections further along the route and maintenance work on sections already completed. The distinction between construction and maintenance was largely theoretical by mid-monsoon, when virtually every section of the road required constant attention just to remain passable. The supply situation for the construction crews was, by any civilized standard, inadequate. The food was serviceable. The Army Quartermaster Corps had developed a mountain ration in 1942 precisely for operations in high altitude or remote terrain, and it provided adequate calories in a compact package. But the other conditions of life on the road front were as difficult as any experienced by American soldiers in any theater of the war. Malaria was endemic throughout the Yukon Valley and the lower elevations of the Patkai Range. The anti-malarial drug atabrine suppressed symptoms but caused nausea and left a characteristic yellow tinge to the skin that reminded everyone who saw it exactly what the jungle was doing to the men who worked in it. Typhus, dysentery, and fungal infections accounted for additional casualties. By the end of the campaign, more than 1,100 American soldiers had died on the Lido Road. The construction of a single mile cost, on average, 1 American life. The men who built it called that accounting, with characteristic understatement. A man a mile. But the road was moving. 3 days ahead of his own aggressive schedule, on the 27th of December, 1943, Pick's lead bulldozer reached Xinjiang in the floor of the Yukon Valley. The first 103 miles were passable. The construction of subsequent sections toward Warzup, toward Myitkyina, toward Bammo and the junction with the old Burma Road continued through 1944 as Stilwell's Chinese divisions fought the Japanese 18th Division for control of the valleys that the road was entering. The relationship between the road and the fighting was inseparable and mutually reinforcing in ways that the strategic planners had never modeled. Pick's convoys were supplying Stilwell's infantry. Stilwell's infantry was clearing the ground that Pick's bulldozers then moved onto. When Myitkyina fell to American and Chinese forces in August of 1944, after a siege that lasted 11 weeks and caused enormous casualties on both sides, the road was able to push through to its next major waypoint, and the fall of Myitkyina delivered the airfield that allowed hump flights to use a lower, safer, more southerly route. The route that caused air deliveries to jump from 18,000 tons in June of 1944 to 39,000 tons in November of the same year. Churchill was not quite right. The need had not passed. It was, in fact, growing. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By late 1944, the Lido Road had connected to the surviving section of the Burma Road near the Chinese border. Those sections of the road through the Yukon Valley still required repair from monsoon damage. The entire 1,079-mile route from Lido to Kunming was, in theory, passable. What remained was to prove it in practice, to send a convoy the full length of the road and demonstrate to everyone who had doubted that the thing Stilwell had imagined and Pick had built was real. Pick organized a convoy himself, 113 vehicles, a 3-star Jeep at the front, cargo trucks carrying a symbolic load of supplies, not the tonnage that would eventually flow through this route, but enough to make the point, American and Chinese flags on the lead vehicles, because the road existed to serve both nations, and both nations had paid for it in blood. On the 12th of January, 1945, at mile marker 0 in Lido, Pick climbed into the Jeep and gave the order. The convoy moved out. It traveled to the Pong Sao Pass, the place the men called Hell Pass, and down into the Yukon Valley, past the battlefields where Stilwell's Chinese had fought the Japanese 18th Division through the previous year, past the bridges over the rivers that the engineer battalions had built and rebuilt again through 2 monsoon seasons. It moved through Myitkyina, where the correspondents and the newsreel cameras were waiting, and continued south and east toward the Burma-China border. At the town of Wanning, on the 28th of January, 1945, the convoy crossed into China. On the 4th of February, 1945, 24 days after departing Lido, it reached Kunming. General Pick, standing on the road in Kunming with the dust of 1,079 miles on his boots, declared it the toughest job ever given to United States Army engineers in wartime. It was not hyperbole. In the 6 months that followed the convoy's arrival in Kunming, trucks on the Lido Road delivered 129,000 tons of supplies to China. By the end of the war, the total was 147,000 tons. 64 truck companies, far short of 375 that had originally been planned, carried over the road heavy artillery, trucks by the tens of thousands, fuel, ammunition, and equipment to rearm 30 Chinese infantry divisions. Those divisions, resupplied to the combination of the Lido Road and the expanded hump airlift, were able to stop an 11-division Japanese offensive in eastern China in 1945 that would otherwise have torn open the last coherent line of Chinese resistance. Churchill's estimate had been elegant and precise, and wrong in a way that many elegant. Precise assessments are wrong by measuring only the parts of the problem that were measurable and ignoring the parts that were not. The tonnage the road delivered was real, but the tonnage the road enabled by securing the route, clearing the Japanese from northern Burma, and opening the safer hump corridor that increased airlift capacity by a factor of 4. That tonnage existed only because the road had been built. The men who built it paid a price that was specific and personal. More than 1,100 names. Equipment accidents in terrain, where a moment of inattention meant a 200-foot fall. Malaria that sent men to hospital for weeks and sometimes killed them when they were too weakened to fight the fever. The particular misery of working in a monsoon downpour on a slope that was actively trying to push them off it. The additional misery of segregation, which meant that 60% of the workforce, the men who had done the heaviest and most dangerous work on the most difficult sections, would receive, in the words of the men themselves, exactly one official recognition of their service in February of 2004 at a Defense Department observance in Florida, nearly 60 years after the convoy reached Kunming. Lewis Pick returned to the United States in 1945. He served as Missouri River Division engineer. In 1949, President Harry Truman appointed him Chief of Engineers of the United States Army Corps. He received the Distinguished Service Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster. He died in 1956. Joseph Stilwell, the man whose strategic vision had made the road possible and whose offensive operations in Burma had made it buildable, never saw it finished. He was relieved of command by Roosevelt in October of 1944 at the insistence of Chiang Kai-shek. 3 months before Pick's convoy reached Kunming, he returned to the United States, was given command of the 10th Army in the Pacific, and was on Okinawa when the war ended. In early 1945, at the suggestion of Chiang Kai-shek, a gesture that the recipient of the suggestion must have found deeply ambiguous, the combined Lido and Burma roads were renamed the Stilwell Road in honor of the general who had been removed before his road was finished. The road itself did not last. It ran through 3 countries, India, Burma, and China, none of which maintained their respective sections after the war ended. Without maintenance, a road through that terrain reverts to jungle quickly. Within a decade of the Japanese surrender, large portions of Pick's Pike were impassable. Today, of the total length of the original road, roughly 60 kilometers remain usable inside India up to the Pongsau Pass, the place the men called Hell Pass. Beyond that, the road largely disappears into the mountains and the jungle that it spent 2.5 years fighting. What remains is the account. The numbers: $150 million, 1,100 lives, 10 major river crossings, 155 secondary bridges, 147,000 tons of supplies delivered, 30 Chinese divisions rearmed, 111 Division Japanese offensive stopped. The human fact: 60% of the American workforce was African American, working on second-hand equipment. 12 to 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, through 5 monsoon seasons, in a jungle that was actively trying to kill them, for a cause that official history would take nearly 60 years to formally acknowledge. And the judgment: Winston Churchill said the road would not be finished before the need for it had passed. He was wrong in a way that mattered, in a way that changed the outcome of the war in Asia. The need had not passed. The need had, in the autumn of 1944, when Myitkyina fell and the Hump Corridor opened and the Chinese divisions began to receive the artillery and ammunition that the road could now deliver, become more acute than at any previous point in the Pacific War. Pick's convoy reached Kunming on the 4th of February, 1945. 6 months later, Japan surrendered. Churchill was almost right. The road was finished just before the need for it ended. That difference, those 6 months, was paved by 1,100 men, most of them the sons of people who were not permitted to eat at the same lunch counters as the correspondents who covered the story. Go back to where this started. A convoy of 113 vehicles on a January morning in Assam. A 3-star jeep at the head of the column. A general who had built the toughest road in the world, because someone had to, because the alternative was to leave 30 Chinese divisions without the artillery to hold their lines, because the men who had died building the road deserved to have a thing they had built actually used. The skeptics had called it impossible. Churchill had called it late. The soldiers who built it called it Pick's Pike. On the 4th of February, 1945, in Kunming, China, the first convoy parked, and the drivers got out of their trucks, and the thing that could not be built was there. To understand what Pick's engineers were actually building toward, and why the skeptics in London and Washington kept underestimating the stakes, you have to understand what Stilwell's soldiers were doing in the valleys ahead of the bulldozers. The Japanese 18th Division had been in northern Burma since the original conquest of 1942. It was not a garrison unit. The 18th had fought in China, had participated in the capture of Singapore, and had pushed the British out of Burma in the spring campaign that closed the road. Its commander, Lieutenant General Shinichi Tanaka, was a methodical and capable officer who understood the terrain he was defending with the precision of a man who had spent months studying it. Tanaka positioned his regiments along the Yukon Valley in a series of defensive boxes, Fortified villages connected by trails that his soldiers knew and the Chinese advancing from the north did not. Each box had to be reduced individually, at close range, at enormous cost in time and casualties. Stilwell's force consisted primarily of Chinese divisions that had retreated into India after the 1942 collapse and had spent the intervening months being retrained and re-equipped at the Ramgarh Training Center in Bihar. These were not the same soldiers who had broken before the Japanese advance. They had been given American weapons, American rations, and American instructors who drilled them in the infantry tactics that Stilwell believed could make them competitive against the Japanese in jungle fighting. Whether that belief was correct was about to be tested in the mud of the Yukon. The campaign began in October of 1943, the same month Pick took command of the road. It would continue for the better part of the year. The fighting in the Yukon Valley was not the kind of fighting that made newspaper front pages. There were no dramatic armored thrusts, no iconic beaches, no city names that resonated with readers at home. There were instead a series of obscure engagements at places called Yupbang Jie, Shara Jie, and Ningbian, names that meant nothing to anyone who had not been there, where Chinese infantry under American advisors fought Japanese infantry dug into the jungle floor at ranges measured in yards. The supply of these Chinese divisions depended entirely on the road Pick was building behind them and the airdrops that supplemented it. AC-47 flying out of an Assam airfield could reach the Yukon Valley and drop supplies, but the quantities were limited and the reliability was hostage to the same weather that was destroying the road below. When the monsoon made air delivery impossible, the Chinese forward units were dependent on what the road could get forward, and what the road could get forward depended on how much it was still passable after the previous night's rain. This was the operational reality that no planning document in London or Washington had adequately modeled. The road was not a future investment in China's war capacity. It was, in the present tense, the supply artery of a fighting army in contact with the enemy. Every delay in construction, every section washed out by the monsoon and not immediately rebuilt, meant Chinese infantry in the Yukon Valley eating reduced rations, firing fewer rounds, holding positions with less margin for error. The road and the battle were the same problem, advancing together or stalling together, inseparable in a way that only became clear when you were standing in the mud at the road front with the sound of artillery carrying from the valley ahead. By the summer of 1944, the campaign had ground its way south to Myitkyina. The town and its airfield sat at the junction of the Irrawaddy River and the northern road network of Burma, and its capture was a strategic objective that Stilwell had been driving toward since the offensive began. The airfield particularly mattered. From Myitkyina, hump transports could fly a route that stayed south of the highest Himalayan ridges, at lower altitude, in weather that was marginally less murderous, without the threat of Japanese fighter interception that had constrained the northern route. The difference in effective capacity between the high northern route and the lower Myitkyina route was not marginal. It was a difference between 18,000 tons a month and 39,000 tons a month, a number that represented the rearming of armies. The siege of Myitkyina lasted from May until the 3rd of August, 1944, 11 weeks of fighting in the worst of the monsoon season, with American Merrill's marauders and Chinese infantry holding the airfield perimeter while Tanaka's garrison defended the town. The cost was severe on both sides. The marauders, who had already been fighting continuously since February, were reduced to a fraction of their original strength by the time the town fell. Of the roughly 3,000 Americans who had entered Burma with the marauders in the spring, fewer than 1,000 remained as effective combatants by the time Myitkyina was secured. But the airfield was open, and with the airfield open, everything changed. Pick's road reached Myitkyina in December of 1944. The bulldozers that had left Lido 2 years earlier had now traveled 262 miles through the Pakai Range and the Yukon Valley and the approaches to Irrawaddy. Ahead lay the crossing of the river itself, a crossing that required the construction of a pontoon bridge more than 1,600 feet long, assembled from barges that were each larger than the landing craft used to carry tanks in the Pacific Island salts. The 1,007th Engineer Battalion built that bridge in 78 days, working in the river current during the dry season with the knowledge that the next monsoon would test every joint and anchor point they put into it. When Pick's convoy finally set out on the 12th of January, 1945, the men who had spent 2 years building the road were watching from the verge. Some of them had been there from the beginning, from the first bulldozer cuts into the Pakai foothills in December of 1942. Some of them had arrived later, replacements for men who had died or been evacuated sick. They had built something that their government had been uncertain about, that Britain's prime minister had publicly dismissed, that the strategic planning community had treated as a distraction from more important priorities. The convoy moved slowly through the mountains. The hairpin curves of the Pongsau Pass required the truck drivers to stop, reverse, and reposition on gradients that offered no margin for error. The road surface, gravel over compacted subgrade, engineered to carry the weight of fully laden cargo trucks, held. Bridges that had been built and rebuilt through 2 monsoon seasons took the weight of the column without yielding. At the Irrawaddy crossing, the pontoon bridge that the 1007 had built in 78 days accepted the convoy without drama. The men who watched the convoy pass, Chinese soldiers in the valley, engineer troops at their road maintenance stations, the occasional British liaison officer at a waypoint, were watching something that most of them had been told, at various points in the preceding 2 years, would never happen. The math had been against it. The weather had been against it. The institutional momentum of Allied strategy, which had consistently prioritized other theaters and other operations, had been against it. Pick's jeep reached Kunming on the 4th of February. He stepped out of the vehicle, looked at the road behind him, and said what he had been saying since October 1943. It was the toughest job ever given to American engineers in wartime. He was not a man given to elaboration. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.